In 1763, a British clergyman named Edward Stone was walking through a water meadow when he chewed on the bark of a plant on a hunch. He had been suffering from fever and joint pain. Within an hour, something shifted. He spent the next 5 years collecting the plant, drying it, and giving preparations of it to parishioners suffering from rheumatic complaints and joint inflammation. He documented 50 cases. Every single one improved. He wrote to the Royal Society of London with his findings. They largely ignored him. More than a century later, chemists identified the active compound found in a related plant, Meadowsweet, and synthesized it into a drug named after the plant's old botanical name. That drug became one of the most widely used medicines in history. The clergyman who spent 5 years carefully documenting what the plant did received almost no credit for it. What that story quietly contains is the same truth that runs through every plant on this list. The compounds that researchers keep returning to for joint health did not originate in laboratories. They originated in the fields, the hedgerows, the lawns, and the garden beds that most people spend money and effort trying to clear. The weeds your joints may be asking for have been growing around you for your entire life. Most people have been pulling them out. Before we begin, an important note. This video is for education and general interest only. It is not medical advice, and nothing here replaces your doctor, especially if you are managing a joint condition or taking medication. We are going to walk through 12 plants, the real historical stories behind them, and what modern researchers have actually looked at, including where that research is still early or limited. We will not give dosages or suggest swapping anything you have been prescribed. 12 plants. Let's get into them. Number 12. Meadowsweet. This is the plant from that story. Meadowsweet. Creamy white flower clusters, a sweet almond fragrance in summer, growing in damp meadows and along stream banks across North America and Europe. Most people who notice it at all think it is decorative at best and a weed at worst. The old botanical name for meadowsweet was Spirea. When chemists eventually synthesized the active compound from this plant and named their drug, they named it after that old botanical name. The plant behind one of history's most recognized medicines is sitting in damp corners of gardens and roadsides across the country for free. What is worth understanding is that meadowsweet and the drug derived from it are not the same thing. Meadowsweet contains salicylate compounds alongside mucilaginous and tannin compounds that the synthesis process stripped away entirely. Some smaller studies have looked at meadowsweet extract and reported anti-inflammatory activity in laboratory settings. This is early research, not a settled clinical finding, and meadowsweet is not a substitute for anything you have been prescribed. What the traditional record shows is 250 years of consistent use for fever and joint discomfort, beginning with a clergyman who was paying close enough attention to document 50 cases before anyone in the scientific establishment was willing to look. For anyone over 60, the story of meadowsweet is less about a specific proven mechanism and more about what careful observation across generations can discover long before clinical trials catch up. How to use it. Dried meadowsweet flowers steeped as tea, mild, pleasantly floral, genuinely the most drinkable plant on this entire list. Grows in any damp corner of the garden without being planted. Speak with your doctor before adding it if you have any sensitivity to salicylate compounds. The plant behind one of history's most famous medicines is available free to anyone willing to look for it. Number 11. Chickweed. Chickweed grows in winter. While every other plant in the garden is dormant and the ground is cold and bare, chickweed spreads into a dense, delicate mat of green from late autumn through early spring. It arrives precisely when bodies feel the cold most, and when joint stiffness, for reasons that researchers are still characterizing, tends to worsen in cold months. Traditional European herbalists wrote about chickweed consistently for what they called hot, inflamed conditions of the joints and skin, cooling, soothing, drawing out heat. That language, repeated across traditions with no contact with each other, describes the same application for the same plant across centuries. Some laboratory research has looked at compounds in chickweed and their interaction with inflammatory pathways in the body. It is worth being clear that this evidence is early, mostly at the laboratory stage rather than in clinical trials with people, and the traditional reputation of chickweed for joint conditions runs considerably deeper than the current clinical evidence supports. For anyone over 60, chickweed is worth knowing primarily for two things: its timing, arriving through the coldest months when fresh plant nutrition is otherwise unavailable, and its vitamin C content, which is genuinely meaningful at a time of year when dietary variety is lowest. Vitamin C is required for collagen synthesis in joint cartilage, a connection that is well established in nutritional research, even if chickweed specifically has not been the subject of large clinical trials. How to use it. Young leaves raw in winter salads. Mild, gently grassy, one of the most approachable wild greens available through cold months. Fresh leaves applied as a simple poultice directly to uncomfortable joints. Crush or blend fresh chickweed, apply to the joint, cover with a cloth. The plant producing medicine through the coldest months of the year is doing so in your garden right now. Most people pull it out in spring without having used it through the winter it grew in. Number 10. Cleavers. If you have ever come back from a walk with small, sticky green burrs covering your clothing, that was cleavers. This plant reproduces by attaching its seeds to anything that passes: animal fur, clothing, garden gloves. It has been distributing itself through human settlements for longer than agriculture has existed, and for most of that time it was considered one of the most important spring tonics available, specifically connected in traditional practice to the lymphatic system. That connection to the lymphatic system is the reason it belongs on a joint health list. The lymphatic system is responsible for clearing fluid and cellular waste from tissue, including the inflammatory waste products that accumulate in and around joints during periods of inflammation. When lymphatic function is sluggish, inflammatory waste accumulates faster than it is removed. Traditional herbalists timed cleavers specifically to early spring, when the body was most burdened after winter, the same period when joint stiffness typically peaks. Modern research on cleavers specifically is limited. This is one where the traditional record runs considerably deeper than the clinical evidence. And it is worth saying that plainly. A small number of studies have found general antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory activity in cleavers extract in laboratory settings, though not studies focused specifically on joints or the lymphatic system. For anyone over 60, cleavers is most honestly described as a plant with a long and consistent traditional history for exactly the seasonal joint stiffness pattern that most people over 60 recognize, and limited, but not absent research attention. How to use it. Cold infusion. Young spring stems and leaves placed in a jar of cold filtered water left overnight in the refrigerator. Strain and drink the next morning. Cold preparation is the traditional method, used specifically because heat degrades the plant's more delicate compounds. The season for cleavers is short, early spring before the plant becomes woody. The plant that has been attaching itself to your clothing on every spring walk was not being a nuisance. It was making itself available at exactly the time it was traditionally considered most useful. Number 9. Broadleaf plantain. You have stepped on this plant today. Almost certainly. Broadleaf plantain grows in every lawn, every pavement crack, every garden path in the temperate world. Native American communities in some regions called it white man's footprint, because it appeared wherever European settlers walked, spreading in disturbed soil, in paths, in settlements. Two completely separate medical traditions with no shared documentation independently identified it for similar applications across centuries of use. That kind of convergence across cultures with no contact is one of the patterns researchers find most worth investigating in traditional plant use. A review examining a substantial body of existing research on plantain confirmed general anti-inflammatory activity across several tissue types in laboratory and animal studies. It is important to be honest about what that means. Laboratory and animal findings are meaningfully different from clinical trials in people with joint conditions, and that line matters. What plantain does have is one of the more developed research bases of any plant on this list, and a traditional record of use for joint and tissue discomfort that spans cultures on multiple continents over centuries. For anyone over 60, plantain is also worth knowing for allantoin, a compound present in the leaves that researchers have studied for its role in tissue repair processes. Cartilage maintenance becomes progressively more difficult after 60 as the body's repair processes naturally slow. A plant with documented tissue-relevant compounds and a centuries-long traditional record for joint applications is worth including in this conversation, even where clinical evidence in people remains limited. How to use it. Young plantain leaves steeped as tea. 10 minutes in just boiled water, mild and slightly green. 2 cups daily as a consistent practice, rather than an acute intervention. Fresh leaves applied as a poultice to uncomfortable joints. Crush the leaves to release the juice, apply, and hold for 20 minutes. The plant in your lawn path has been growing there your entire life. It has simply been waiting to be recognized. Number 8. Comfrey. This plant has one of the most direct names in the entire traditional herbal record. Knitbone. Not a marketing name, not poetry. A functional description that was applied independently across cultures with no contact with each other, based on centuries of consistent observation about what people believed this plant did for damaged tissue. The Latin genus name Symphytum comes from the Greek word meaning to grow together. When separate traditions land on the same descriptive name for the same plant through independent observation, that convergence is a signal worth paying attention to, though naming history is not the same as clinical proof, and it is important to keep that distinction clear. Some studies have looked at topical comfrey preparations and reported outcomes researchers described as encouraging for soft tissue discomfort. These are smaller studies rather than large, definitive clinical trials, and results vary. Here is an important safety note that genuinely matters. Comfrey contains compounds that can stress the liver with prolonged internal use. This is exactly why traditional use of comfrey leaned heavily toward external topical preparations, rather than teas or internal consumption. If you are considering comfrey, speak with your doctor first. This is not a throwaway caution, it specifically applies here. The traditional wisdom about keeping comfrey topical, rather than internal, reflects real observation about the plant's potency in both directions. For anyone over 60, comfrey is most honestly described as a plant with a compelling traditional record for tissue and joint applications, some early research support for topical use specifically, and a safety profile that requires an informed conversation with your healthcare provider before use. How to use it. Topical only. Comfrey leaf or root prepared as a poultice applied externally to the painful area, covered with a cloth, left for 30 to 60 minutes. Comfrey-based creams are commercially available. Do not use internally, without explicit guidance from your doctor. The name Knitbone was not given casually. 2,000 years of careful observation produced that name. The safety consideration is part of the same careful observation. Number 7. Horsetail. Horsetail is one of the oldest plants on Earth. Not old the way an oak tree is old. Old in a way that makes oak trees seem recent. Horsetail has existed in something close to its current form for over 350 million years, predating dinosaurs, predating flowering plants, predating most of what we recognize as modern plant life. The horsetail growing in a damp ditch along an American roadside today is structurally identical to fossils from the Carboniferous period. Roman soldiers reportedly consumed horsetail tea specifically in connection with joint and tissue complaints. Medieval herbalists used it consistently for similar conditions. The application was so consistent across cultures with no contact that researchers investigating traditional uses eventually asked the obvious question: what does this plant contain that might explain the observation? The answer that drew research attention was silica, specifically bioavailable orthosilicic acid, the form of silica the body can actually absorb. Horsetail contains an unusually high concentration of this form. Silica is connected to how the body forms and maintains connective tissue, including the collagen matrix of joint cartilage. Some research has looked at supplemental silica from horsetail and markers associated with connective tissue. This is a genuinely interesting area of ongoing research, rather than a settled clinical conclusion. For anyone over 60, the interest in horsetail is specifically about the silica-collagen connection. Collagen synthesis and maintenance in joint cartilage becomes progressively less efficient with age, and silicon is one of the cofactors involved in that process that most joint supplements entirely overlook. One practical note: Horsetail absorbs whatever is in the surrounding soil, including contaminants, so sourcing from a reputable commercial supplier matters if you are curious about it. How to use it. Dried horsetail simmered gently in water for 10 minutes. Simmering rather than steeping improves extraction from the tough stems. 1 cup daily as a consistent practice. Source from a reputable supplier rather than gathering wild unless you are certain of the growing location. Speak with your doctor before adding it if you have kidney concerns. Horsetail has mild diuretic properties. A living fossil, growing along roadsides everywhere, with a story that outlasted the dinosaurs and a research question that modern science is still working to fully answer. Number 6. Boswellia. This is the frankincense of the ancient world. The resin that ancient Egyptians burned in temples, that traveled the Silk Road as one of the most valuable traded commodities of the ancient world, that appears in Ayurvedic texts describing joint conditions over 3,000 years ago. It was never purely ceremonial. Arabic physicians documented it specifically in connection with joints and connective tissue. Ayurvedic physicians described it in relation to swollen, uncomfortable joints. Whatever was moving this resin across entire continents at enormous expense, people clearly believed it was worth the journey. Boswellia is one of the better studied plants on this list in terms of modern research. Several studies, including some clinical trials, have looked at Boswellia extract in relation to joint comfort and mobility, with researchers examining specific compounds in the resin and the inflammatory pathways they may interact with. Results across studies vary, and this is an area of ongoing research rather than a settled conclusion. But the research base for Boswellia is meaningfully more developed than for most plants in the traditional herbal record for joint conditions. For anyone over 60, Boswellia is worth discussing with your doctor specifically, because it has enough research attention to make that conversation substantive rather than speculative. The active compounds are fat-soluble, which is why traditional preparations consistently combine the resin with a fat source, an empirically derived preparation detail that predated any understanding of fat-soluble absorption by thousands of years. How to use it. Boswellia extract is available commercially as a standardized supplement. Discuss appropriate use and amounts with your doctor or a qualified healthcare provider, particularly if you are taking any medications, as interactions are possible. The resin itself can be chewed directly, the traditional preparation. Ancient traders moved this resin across entire continents. They did not have the research we have now, but the research that has since accumulated suggests they were paying attention to something real. Number 5. Devil's Claw. Deep in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa, the San people have used a plant called Devil's Claw for generations, named for the sharp curved projections on its fruit that allow it to attach to passing animals, a dispersal mechanism as aggressive as cleavers, in terrain as harsh as any plant survives. The San used the root specifically for joint discomfort, fever, and digestive complaints. When researchers first began studying it in the early 20th century, some were openly skeptical. The plant grows in one of the harshest environments on Earth and did not match expectations of what a refined medicinal plant should look like. What they found changed that assessment. Devil's Claw has become one of the more clinically studied plants on this list. Several trials have specifically examined its relationship to joint discomfort, and researchers have looked at compounds in the root and the inflammatory pathways they may influence. A Cochrane review, one of the most rigorous forms of evidence synthesis available, examined the research on Devil's Claw for back and joint discomfort and concluded the evidence was worth taking seriously. It is important to be direct about what this does not mean. The research does not establish that Devil's Claw is equivalent to or a substitute for any medication. That is not what the studies show, and it is not a comparison we are going to make. What the research does show is consistent enough that it is worth a conversation with your doctor, particularly because Devil's Claw has mild blood-thinning properties that matter if you are on any related medication. For anyone over 60 managing joint discomfort, Devil's Claw is honestly one of the plants on this list with the strongest research basis for that specific conversation. How to use it. Commercially available as a standardized extract. Discuss appropriate use and amounts with your doctor before adding it, particularly if you take any blood-thinning medications or have any cardiovascular concerns. The San people of the Kalahari were paying close attention to a plant growing in one of the least forgiving landscapes on the planet for generations before any researcher arrived to ask why. The research that eventually followed suggests the attention was warranted. Number 4. Stinging nettle. This plant introduces itself memorably. Most people know nettle from the sting. What most people do not know is that Roman physicians stationed in Britain reportedly recommended nettle specifically in connection with joint discomfort, not applied to the skin but consumed as food. Soldiers rubbing fresh nettle on cold, stiff legs in the field, and soldiers eating nettle as part of their diet were in a sense doing two different things at once. The external applications stimulated circulation. The internal consumption was working through a different pathway entirely. Nettle has attracted meaningful modern research interest. It is genuinely one of the more actively studied plants on this list for joint-related applications. Some studies have looked at nettle leaf preparations and markers connected to the body's inflammatory response, and researchers have examined specific compounds in the plant and the pathways they may interact with. As always, results across studies vary, and this is ongoing research rather than a settled conclusion. What makes nettle particularly interesting for anyone over 60 is the breadth of its nutritional profile alongside its inflammatory research base. Iron, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and vitamin K in concentrations that exceed most cultivated greens, arriving alongside whatever direct joint-relevant activity the plant may provide. The Roman soldiers who reached for this plant in cold, wet climates were observing something. It took a very long time for researchers to begin characterizing how to use it. Young nettle leaves blanched for 60 seconds in boiling water. Heat neutralizes the sting completely and leaves no residue whatsoever. Cook exactly as you would spinach. Dried nettle steeped as tea, 10 minutes, 2 cups daily, as a consistent practice. The blanching water is a concentrated mineral liquid. Add it to soups rather than discarding it. Speak with your doctor if you are on blood pressure medication or diuretics, as nettle has mild effects on both. Number 3. Dandelion. You know this plant. You have probably spent money trying to remove it. Dandelion's traditional reputation for joint health connects to something most people never think about: uric acid. Uric acid is a waste product the body produces naturally during normal cellular processes. When it accumulates in the bloodstream faster than the kidneys can clear it, crystals can form in and around joint spaces. This is the underlying process behind gout, one of the more painful joint conditions, and it becomes more common after 60 as kidney filtration efficiency naturally changes with age. Dandelion leaf and root have been studied for their diuretic properties, their connection to increased urine production, which is one of the body's primary mechanisms for clearing metabolic waste, including uric acid. Some research has confirmed this diuretic effect in people specifically, not in laboratory settings only but in a human trial, which places dandelion's diuretic action in a somewhat more evidenced category than several other plants on this list. It is important to keep the distinction clear. The research confirms the diuretic effect, not a direct claim about treating gout or joint pain specifically. Dandelion root also contains inulin, a prebiotic fiber that feeds specific beneficial gut bacteria. Research increasingly suggests connections between gut microbiome health and systemic inflammatory patterns, though the specific implications for joint conditions remain an emerging rather than settled area. For anyone over 60, dandelion is honestly one of the more interesting plants on this list because its documented properties, improved renal clearance, and gut microbiome support both connect to mechanisms that are genuinely relevant to joint health through established biological pathways, even where direct joint-specific clinical trials are limited. How to use it. Dandelion root tea. Dried root simmered 10 minutes in water, 1 to 2 cups daily. Young leaves in salads or sautéed briefly in olive oil. Harvest only from unsprayed ground. Speak with your doctor if you are on diuretic medications. The combined effect is real, and your doctor needs to know. The plant you have been removing from your lawn for years has one of the more genuinely interesting research and traditional stories on this entire list. Number 2. Turmeric with black pepper. Most people are already aware of turmeric for joint health. Most people are using it in a way that delivers a fraction of what it could offer. and the reason comes down to a preparation detail that most people have never heard. The active compound in turmeric is poorly absorbed by the body on its own. Most of what is consumed in standard preparations passes through without entering the bloodstream in meaningful amounts. This is likely part of why turmeric is sometimes used for extended periods with underwhelming results. Black pepper contains a compound called piperine. Research has found that piperine significantly increases how much of turmeric's active compound the body actually absorbs. Some studies report a dramatic increase in measured absorption when the two are combined. Indian cooking has combined turmeric and black pepper in traditional preparations for thousands of years, long before anyone understood the biochemical reason why. The combination worked better than turmeric alone, and generations of careful cooks noticed it. Turmeric itself has been studied fairly extensively. It is one of the more researched plant compounds connected to the body's inflammatory response, including some studies specifically looking at joint comfort and mobility. As always, results across studies vary, and this is ongoing research rather than a settled clinical conclusion. Fat additionally improves absorption, since the active compound is fat-soluble. The traditional preparation in warm milk with black pepper was empirically optimized for maximum delivery long before anyone understood why. For anyone over 60, the single most impactful change most people can make to how they use turmeric costs nothing and takes 10 seconds. Add black pepper every time. How to use it. Always with a pinch of black pepper, never turmeric alone. Add at the end of cooking rather than the beginning to reduce heat degradation of the active compounds. In warm milk, in olive oil, in food, the combination is what traditional preparations consistently used. The 10-second habit of adding black pepper is the preparation difference that changes what you are actually consuming. Number 1. Yarrow. We end where the story of battlefield plant medicine largely begins. Yarrow's scientific name, Achillea, comes from Achilles. Legend holds that he carried yarrow into battle at Troy and used it on the wounds of his soldiers. Whether the story is literally true or mythological, it encodes a real and widespread tradition. Yarrow was the battlefield wound and joint herb of ancient Europe, carried by Roman military physicians, used by medieval battlefield surgeons, documented in military medical practice across centuries. Native American communities across North America used yarrow independently, arriving at many of the same traditional applications with no shared contact whatsoever. The same convergence pattern that runs through this entire list: separate cultures, no contact, same plant, same application. Some research has looked at compounds in yarrow and general anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial activity in laboratory settings. Researchers have also examined yarrow's traditional connection to peripheral circulation, the idea that healthy blood flow to tissue surrounding joints matters for joint comfort, since cartilage itself has no direct blood supply and depends on nearby circulation for nutrients and for the removal of waste products. This is a reasonable and biologically grounded area of traditional application, though direct clinical research on yarrow and joint conditions specifically remains limited. For anyone over 60, yarrow is most honestly described as a plant with one of the longest and most geographically widespread traditional records on this entire list. Used by cultures on multiple continents across thousands of years for exactly the joint and wound conditions that aging creates, and a research base that is still developing rather than complete. The tradition runs deeper than the current evidence. That does not make the tradition wrong. It makes it worth continued attention. How to use it. Dried yarrow flowers and leaves steeped as tea. 10 minutes in just boiled water, 1 to 2 cups daily as a consistent practice. Fresh leaves applied as a simple poultice to uncomfortable areas. Grows in almost every American lawn. Most people mow it down without recognition. It was once considered important enough to carry into war. The only thing that has changed is whether anyone stops to look. It is worth being honest about something before we close. Throughout this video, we have tried to be careful about a distinction that matters enormously. Traditionally used and clinically proven are not the same claim. Some plants on this list, Boswellia, devil's claw, nettle, turmeric, have meaningful modern research behind them. Others like Cleavers and Chickweed lean much more heavily on tradition than on clinical evidence. Both categories are worth knowing. Neither is a substitute for talking to your doctor, especially if you are managing a joint condition or taking medication.